Mentioning the name of Charles Luciano has long carried a certain weight. For anyone interested in Mafia history, it immediately brings to mind the image of a criminal visionary, a man portrayed as someone who almost single-handedly created and then commanded the most powerful criminal organization in the United States, often referred to as the crime syndicate. Over time, Luciano has been described as the figure who reshaped Cosa Nostra, reorganized its structure, and effectively assembled an entire army of killers under a unified system. In popular retellings, his approval was treated as mandatory for anyone who wanted to establish themselves within the American criminal underworld. When that image is examined closely, cracks begin to show. What emerges is not a simple legend, but a figure shaped by circumstance, reputation, and hindsight. Much of what people believe about Luciano was formed under pressure, first during his lifetime and then intensified after his death. He was not the uncontested kingpin of all gangsters, ruling without challenge, and he was not a hollow invention propped up by myth alone. The reality sits in a narrower, more uncomfortable space between admiration and exaggeration. Understanding that middle ground is essential to understanding Luciano himself. The story that follows is not about tearing down a legend or glorifying it further. It is about tracing how Salvatore Luciano became Charles Lucky Luciano, and how the man behind the reputation was shaped long before power, titles, or headlines entered the picture. This is the real story, stripped of ceremony, beginning on the other side of the law. Salvatore Luciano was born on November 11, 1897, in a small village in Sicily, into the family of Antonio and Rosalia Luciano. His early life was defined by the same limits that trapped so many families in southern Italy at the time. Antonio Luciano worked in a local sulfur mine, a job marked by exhaustion, danger, and little reward. Now, like countless others worn down by that reality, he eventually reached a breaking point. In 1906, after years of hard labor with no path forward, Antonio made the decision to leave Sicily behind and search for a better future in the New World. Within a year of arriving in New York City, Antonio managed to establish himself just enough to send for his family. In 1907, Rosalia followed him across the Atlantic with Salvatore, his older brother, and his sister. What awaited them, however, was far from the promise they had imagined. New York was not a land of immediate opportunity for newly arrived immigrants. The Luciano family had left poverty behind in Sicily, only to encounter it again in a different form. The contrast was striking. In their Sicilian village, daily life had been defined by the smell of sulfur drifting from the mines. In New York, young Salvatore was greeted by something else entirely. At the time of his arrival, waves of labor strikes by janitors and garbage collectors had left large parts of the city buried in waste. The streets of the Lower East Side, where the Luciano family settled, were overwhelmed with rotting garbage. For a child arriving in America for the first time, this was his introduction to the new world. The neighborhood itself was just as important as its conditions. Salvatore did not grow up in an isolated Italian enclave. The Lower East Side was a crowded mix of nationalities, with Jewish, Irish, and Italian families living side by side. This environment would quietly shape him in ways that many other future Mafia figures never experienced. Growing up among different cultures meant that Salvatore learned early how to move between groups, how to observe differences, and how to cooperate without rigid loyalty to a single ethnic line. In time, this would allow him to avoid the deep prejudices that limited other Italian gangsters and would later open doors to partnerships that others refused to consider. At the same time, this upbringing made him more Americanized than many of his peers, who remained tied to old world traditions. That adaptation would eventually work in his favor, even if it also set him apart from more traditional figures in organized crime. None of this mattered yet. For now, Salvatore was just a 9-year-old boy navigating filthy streets on his way to his first day at an American school. The streets themselves were already teaching lessons no classroom could match. Beyond the garbage and overcrowding, they were filled with gangs of every size and age. Some were run by adults, others by children barely older than Salvatore himself. The difference between them was scale, not intent. Theft, extortion, territory fights, and constant confrontation were part of daily life. In this environment, the choice between dull schoolwork and the adrenaline of street life was rarely a difficult one. For many children growing up there, The streets offered excitement, protection, and a sense of belonging that school never could. Salvatore Luciano was no exception. Joining a gang was not just appealing in that environment, it was almost unavoidable. An isolated existence was practically impossible. A child who walked alone through those streets had no real way to defend himself. What awaited him instead was a steady routine of beatings, theft, and intimidation. The Lower East Side functioned like a stone jungle, and without a group of your own, survival became a daily struggle. Protection was not optional. It was a requirement imposed by the streets themselves. Salvatore found his own pack early. His group carried out the same kinds of robberies as the other youth gangs around them, taking whatever opportunities the streets allowed. But Luciano showed an instinct that already set him apart. He noticed a pattern in the neighborhood. Jewish children were frequently targeted by Italian and Irish gangs, often repeatedly, with no real way to fight back. Luciano turned that imbalance into an opportunity. He organized a crude but effective protection service, offering Jewish kids safe passage through the streets in exchange for a small fee. Many agreed. What made this arrangement different was that it created a steady stream of income without constant violence. Compared to outright robbery, it was almost legal by street standards. This early operation showed Luciano's ability to think beyond brute force. He was learning how control, organization, and predictability could be just as profitable as intimidation. It was an early glimpse of how he viewed crime, not as chaos, but as structure. There is a long-standing legend that it was during this period that Salvatore first met his future partner in crime, Meyer Lansky. Whether that meeting happened exactly as later stories describe is impossible to confirm. What is clear is that the chances of their paths crossing were high. Lansky lived in the same Lower East Side environment, moving through the same streets, surrounded by the same ethnic mix and criminal energy. Even if their first encounter did not happen at this exact moment, the groundwork for their future association was already being laid. What is not disputed is that Salvatore enjoyed street life far more than school. His attendance became irregular, then rare. Teachers and supervisors increasingly showed up at his family's apartment, warning his parents that their son was slipping beyond control. Those warnings eventually turned into consequences. In 1912, Salvatore was sent to a closed juvenile detention facility for troubled youth. He spent 4 months there, removed from the streets, but not corrected by the experience. By the age of 14, he had dropped out of school entirely, took his first legal job as a courier at Max Goodman's hat store, earning somewhere between $5 and $7 a week. On paper, it looked like a step toward stability. In reality, nothing had changed. Luciano never abandoned his criminal activities. He simply layered them beneath a thin cover of legitimate work. Once again, he gathered a small group around him, returning to theft and acting as runners in drug transactions for a local dealer. Tensions at home continued to grow. After an argument with his father, triggered by a gun discovered among his belongings, Salvatore left the family apartment. He rented a room with one of his associates, Joe Biondo, a name that would later resurface at a much higher level within the Gambino crime family. At the time, it was simply another step deeper into independence and street life. This pattern continued until 1916, when Luciano was caught during a drug sale. He handed a dose of heroin to a man who turned out to be a police informant. On June 27, 1916, at just 18 years old, Salvatore Luciano was sentenced to 8 months in prison at New Hampton Farms Correctional Facility. It was his first adult sentence, and it would leave a mark far beyond the length of the term. After his release, Luciano made a decision that seemed minor, but carried symbolic weight. He changed his name from Salvatore to Charles. During his incarceration, his name had been shortened to Sally, a nickname that quickly became a source of mockery among other inmates. The jokes were relentless, and by the time he walked free, he was done with it. The name change was not about reinvention yet, but about control. He would decide how he was addressed. For a brief period after prison, Charles took a job as a ship's clerk. That phase ended abruptly when he won nearly an entire year's salary, $244, in one stroke of luck.
Wow.
From that moment on, he abandoned legal work altogether. His focus shifted fully and deliberately toward crime as a profession, not a fallback. The years between 1916 and 1920 remain one of the least documented periods of his life. Records are scarce, details are thin, and what exists is fragmented. But it was during this quiet stretch that Charles Luciano was laying foundations that would only become visible later. What can be stated with confidence is that Charles Luciano continued building his criminal career without interruption. Some sources claim he returned to working with the same gang he had been involved with before his imprisonment. Others suggest that he began moving closer to Meyer Lansky and Lansky's partner, Ben Siegel. When viewed through the lens of what followed, both versions appear compatible rather than contradictory. Luciano would later operate across multiple criminal groups at the same time, advancing his interests in parallel rather than tying himself to a single organization. That pattern was not accidental. Charles consistently placed personal profit above everything else. Loyalty, affiliation, and even identity were tools, not principles. He used them when they served his interests and discarded them when they did not. This approach would become one of his defining traits. And by 1920, he was given the perfect opportunity to put it into practice on a much larger scale. That opportunity arrived with the introduction of prohibition in the United States. For Luciano, the years leading up to the Castellamores War were defined by constant networking and quiet collaboration with figures who would later dominate New York's criminal landscape. During this period, he was not a kingpin, but a connector, steadily building relationships that would pay off later. His early prohibition operations began alongside Lansky and the Jewish gang operating out of the same neighborhoods. At first, their approach was simple. They robbed liquor stores and resold the stolen alcohol to bars. The method worked briefly, but its limits became clear almost immediately. Once the warehouses emptied their remaining legal stock, that supply dried up. Luciano adapted quickly. Together with his longtime associate Joe Biondo, who had recently been released from prison, he shifted toward converting legal industrial alcohol into drinkable liquor. Industrial alcohol was readily available and legal for manufacturing purposes. Luciano's operation focused on processing it into crude imitations of known alcoholic beverages, which were then distributed to bars willing to take the risk. Another source came from perfume factories, where alcohol was used in production. That alcohol was purchased, repurposed, bottled, and sold through the same underground channels. Beyond direct sales, Luciano also made money supplying raw materials to independent moonshiners who handled their own distillation. As these ventures expanded, Luciano's capital grew steadily. He moved beyond distribution and into production, opening his own distilleries. He also secured a contract to supply whiskey to one of the largest wholesalers operating during the early days of Prohibition. This brought him into contact with figures who functioned less like traditional gangsters and more like financiers of organized crime. One of them was Arnold Rothstein, a man often described as a criminal venture capitalist. Rothstein invested in illegal enterprises run by other gangsters, shaping much of the Jewish underworld during that era. His involvement helped solidify Luciano's connection with Lansky and opened further doors. Through these ties, Luciano gained access to the gang led by Jack Diamond, which handled bootlegging operations, and engaged in a wide range of criminal activities from hijacking rival shipments to armed robbery. Another well-known figure, Dutch Schultz, also moved within this same circle. While building these alliances with Jewish and Irish gangs, Luciano never neglected his ties to Italian criminals. Through Joe Biondo, he maintained connections to what would later be known as the Gambino family. At the same time, he worked with Willie Moretti, a cousin of Frank Costello, to establish additional distilleries. These relationships ensured that Luciano was never dependent on a single group or territory. The most significant connection of this period, however, was with Joe Masseria. Widely known as Joe the Boss, Masseria and his organization controlled the entire Lower East Side, the same territory where Luciano and Lansky were running their bootlegging operations. Their interests inevitably overlapped. Luciano's growing presence did not go unnoticed. Eventually, Masseria took notice of him and brought him into his organization, recruiting Charles as an outside gunman. It was a move that would bind Luciano to forces far larger than his own operation, setting the stage for what was to come. In 1920, the organization led by Joe Masseria was already one of the dominant forces in New York's underworld. 2 years later, in 1922, Charles Luciano formally joined that organization. The timing was not accidental. That same year, Masseria became entangled in a violent internal mafia conflict. A rival figure, Umberto Valenti, attempted to challenge Masseria's position and authority. What followed was a brief but brutal war, one that would quietly accelerate Luciano's rise. Valenti made the first move, but Joe Masseria survived the initial attack. He responded quickly and decisively. Just 3 days later, Masseria arranged a meeting with Valenti under the pretense of settling the dispute and restoring peace. The meeting was a trap. Masseria arrived with 3 armed men, one of them Charles Luciano. When the confrontation turned violent, it was Luciano who managed to kill Valenti during the shootout. That single act removed a dangerous rival and proved Luciano's usefulness in the most direct way possible. This conflict did not end immediately. The war dragged on for another year, claiming the lives of several high-ranking members within Masseria's organization. In that environment, survival mattered as much as loyalty. Luciano not only survived, but continued generating significant income for the family throughout the violence. Those 2 factors combined worked in his favor. By 1923, Charles Luciano was promoted to the position of capo within Joe Masseria's organization. Along with the title came control over Masseria's gambling operations, a lucrative and influential portfolio. Around the same period, Frank Costello also entered Masseria's family. Whether Luciano and Costello had known each other before Prohibition remains unclear. What is known is that by this point, they were already doing business together. During Prohibition, they shared a whiskey supply route into New York alongside Irish gangster William Dwyer. These arrangements were not casual partnerships. They were calculated alliances built around logistics, profit, and reliability. Luciano's network continued expanding. During Prohibition, he did business with several figures who would later occupy powerful positions in the criminal hierarchy. One of the more significant names during this phase was Vito Genovese. Even though Luciano was now a capo within Masseria's organization, he did not limit himself to internal operations. Side ventures remained central to how he operated. His relationship with Meyer Lansky remained close. At one point, they even rented a hotel room together and used it as a shared headquarters. Luciano also continued working with Jack Diamond's crew. More surprisingly, he maintained business ties with Arnold Rosenthal, despite Rosenthal being in a Cold War with Luciano's immediate boss. Rosenthal was one of the largest heroin wholesalers in New York at the time, and Luciano was still involved in drug trafficking alongside his other ventures. That decision nearly cost him everything. In 1923, Luciano was arrested once again after selling drugs to an undercover police officer. This was his second drug charge, and the consequences were far more serious. He was facing the possibility of a 10-year prison sentence. To avoid it, Luciano made a deal. In exchange for a complete dismissal of the charges, he provided law enforcement with the location of his own stash, goods valued at approximately $150,000. From the Mafia's perspective, this placed him in a gray area. Luciano had not informed on anyone else. He had testified only against himself. Technically, he had not betrayed the organization, but the fact remained that he had cooperated with authorities and escaped serious punishment. That decision damaged his reputation. While he avoided prison, trust around him weakened. After 1923, Luciano entered a relatively quiet period that lasted nearly 6 years. There were no dramatic power moves or public confrontations. The only major underworld event during that time was the death of Arnold Rothstein, which did not directly affect Luciano's position. Otherwise, his life settled into a routine of small-scale raids, continued involvement in illegal alcohol, and occasional minor arrests. It was the standard rhythm of a working gangster during Prohibition. But that calm was deceptive. Beneath the surface, tensions were building, alliances were shifting, and unresolved conflicts were waiting for an opening. This period was not an ending. It was a pause. And when it broke, it would push Charles Luciano closer to the goals he had been quietly positioning himself to reach. The period of the Castellamoris War marked a turning point not only for Charles Luciano, but for the Italian Mafia in the United States as a whole. It was a moment of rupture, dividing the underworld into a clear before and after. By the time the conflict ended, Cosa Nostra had taken the shape that later generations would come to recognize, and Luciano would emerge as the leader of his own Mafia family. But before turning directly to the war itself, there is another persistent myth surrounding Luciano's life that needs to be addressed because it continues to shape how his story is told. This is the famous story of Luciano's brutal beating, the one he supposedly survived against all odds, earning him the nickname Lucky. For those unfamiliar with the legend, it is usually told like this. On the evening of October 16, 1929, Luciano was invited to a meeting with Salvatore Maranzano, the leader of a faction opposing Luciano's boss, Joe Masseria. During the meeting, Maranzano allegedly demanded that Luciano betray and kill Joe the boss. When Luciano refused, the story claims that Maranzano ordered him tortured to force compliance. After a severe beating and still no agreement, Luciano was supposedly dumped into a ditch and left for dead. According to the same version, Luciano later regained consciousness and by around 1 o'clock in the morning, managed to reach Highland Boulevard on Staten Island. There, a patrolman found him and transported him to the hospital. Meyer Lansky reportedly visited him there and, impressed by his survival, gave him the nickname Lucky. This story became widely accepted and retold for decades, forming a key part of Luciano's public image. The problem is that this version rests on an extremely fragile foundation. The story first appeared in the book The Last Testament of Lucky Luciano, which was said to be based on notes taken by Martin Gosch, a journalist who spoke with Luciano shortly before his death. Those notes were never seen by anyone other than Richard Hammer, the author who published the book. According to Hammer, the notes were destroyed by Gosch's widow, and Gosch himself died shortly before the book was released. That alone makes independent verification impossible. More importantly, large portions of the book were later challenged by people who were directly involved in the events it described. Hammer himself admitted that Gosch's notes read more like the script of a gangster action film than a factual biography. That assessment makes sense considering Gosch had been preparing a movie project about Luciano at the time. The dramatization served a purpose, but it did not serve accuracy. The beating story was not only questioned by historians and associates, but also contradicted by Luciano himself. He told a very different version of events to Salvatore Vizzini, a covert drug agent who was closely connected to Luciano in the 1950s and spent time within his inner circle. According to that account, there was no Mafia torture, and Maranzano had nothing to do with what happened. The reality, as Luciano described it, was far less cinematic. On that day, he was abducted by police officers who were investigating a murder at the Hotsy Totsy Club. They were searching for Jack Diamond, a close associate of Luciano and the prime suspect in the killing. During the interrogation, things escalated. The officers used excessive force, believed they had killed him, and panicked. To cover their actions, they dumped Luciano on Staten Island and left him there. Later, a patrolman found him and brought him to the hospital, exactly as documented. Vizzini included this account in his official reports in the late 1950s. Despite that, when The Last Testament of Lucky Luciano appeared in the 1970s, it presented the torture narrative involving Maranzano as fact. Beyond the testimony, even basic logic undermines the myth. By 1929, Luciano was already a high-ranking member of Masseria's faction. If Maranzano had truly beaten him and left him alive, it would have meant deliberately creating a powerful enemy. That would have been an irrational and dangerous move in the middle of an already volatile conflict. If the story of Maranzano's torture were true, Luciano's survival would have marked him for immediate execution, not future leadership. The fact that he lived, rose, and eventually prevailed tells a different story altogether. If that beating had really been a Mafia message, this narrative would have ended there, with a funeral rather than a transformation. That incident was not the moment Luciano became known as Lucky. Lansky had nothing to do with the origin of the name either. The nickname came from the newspapers, not from the hospital room. It appeared several years before the beating, and was most likely rooted in Luciano's youth. The name Lucky is widely believed to have grown out of a simple abbreviation of his surname, Luciano, which as Lee lent itself to the word luck. Over time, repetition turned it into an identity. The myth attached itself later, retroactively reshaping the meaning of the name. If Salvatore Maranzano had no role in the beating story, he was central to what followed next. Maranzano stood at the forefront of the Castellammore's War. He arrived in the United States in 1925, fleeing Sicily as Benito Mussolini's fascist regime tightened its grip and disrupted traditional Mafia power structures. Like many others, forced out by political pressure, Maranzano brought both ambition and connections with him. In America, He quickly gained influence among fellow Sicilians from Castellammare del Golfo. His rise was accelerated by backing from Italy, most notably from the powerful Mafia figure Don Vito Cascioferro. As expected, Maranzano became deeply involved in bootlegging. His growing operations inevitably clashed with Joe Masiria, who by that time had secured the title of boss of all bosses. From that point forward, tension was no longer avoidable. Maranzano's men and Masiria's crews began intercepting and attacking each other's liquor shipments. These confrontations steadily escalated. At the same time, Masiria's ambitions extended beyond New York. He openly supported Al Capone in Chicago during Capone's conflict with rivals tied to Joe Aiello. Masiria also moved to eliminate Gaspar Milazzo, whose Detroit operations threatened his expanding influence. This pattern revealed Masiria's broader objective. He wanted control over everything within reach. That hunger for dominance created resentment on all sides. The conflict turned openly violent with two key murders. In February 1930, Gaetano Reina, who had broken away from Masiria's faction and aligned himself with Maranzano, was killed. Then, in May of the same year, Gaspar Milazzo was assassinated on Masiria's orders. After that, restraint vanished, killings multiplied, and both factions began losing men at a steady pace. From the perspective of Luciano's story, the precise sequence of every killing matters less than one critical detail. Luciano did not want this war. He made a deliberate effort to distance himself from the violence. In late August of 1930, he left the country with Jack Diamond and traveled to Germany, attempting to establish his own drug smuggling network. While others were fighting for dominance, Luciano was looking for ways to protect his income and reduce exposure. By then, however, the conflict had already reached full momentum. Murders were drawing unwanted attention from law enforcement, disrupting supply lines and draining profits. For Luciano, the war represented financial instability. Gradually, others involved in the conflict began reaching the same conclusion. Violence was becoming bad for business. As the months passed, it became increasingly clear that Masiria's organization was losing ground. Doubts spread among his inner circle. The idea of removing Joe the boss, once unthinkable, began circulating quietly. At the same time, Maranzano made his position clear. He stated that his only objective was Masiria's death. He promised not to pursue retaliation against others once that goal was achieved. By the spring of 1931, that offer was accepted. Luciano met with Maranzano and confirmed that arrangements were in motion. On April 15th of that year, Joe Masiria was murdered inside a restaurant in Coney Island. With his death, the Castellamore's War effectively ended. Luciano did not hide his role in what had happened. He openly accepted responsibility for organizing the assassination. Later recalled by Nick Gentile in his biography, Luciano made sure Maranzano understood one thing clearly. Masiria was killed because it served Luciano's interests. It was not done as a favor. It was not done out of loyalty. It was done because it benefited Charles Luciano. In the end, Luciano made his position unmistakably clear. Any attempt to continue hunting down members of the former Masiria faction would immediately restart the war. There would be no gradual cleanup, no delayed revenge. Maranzano accepted these terms, and for the moment, treated them as the conditions of his victory. With Joe Masiria dead and the Castellamore's War formally over, Maranzano moved quickly to consolidate power. Shortly afterward, he convened a general meeting of Sicilian gangsters in the Bronx. The gathering served two purposes. First, it publicly marked his triumph. Second, it laid the foundation for a new organizational structure that would define the New York Mafia for decades. At this meeting, it was agreed that all Sicilian gangs operating in New York would be reorganized into 5 families. Each family would be led by a boss, supported by an underboss, creating a standardized hierarchy where none had formally existed before. Under this arrangement, Luciano became the head of the former Masiria organization, which would later be known as the Genovese family. Vito Genovese was appointed as his underboss. Joseph Bonanno was named boss of what became the Bonanno family. Joe Profaci took control of the organization that would later be called the Colombo family. Tom Gagliano was placed in charge of what evolved into the Lucchese family. The newly formed Gambino family was headed by Vincent Mangano. Above all 5 bosses stood Maranzano himself, now holding the revived title of boss of all bosses. That position, however, did not bring stability. Maranzano had achieved dominance, but what he wanted next was absolute authority. Like Mafia before him, he sought undisputed control, power that could not be challenged or negotiated. That ambition quickly unsettled both his former enemies and his supposed allies. One of Maranzano's early supporters later recalled that by claiming the title of boss of all bosses, he revealed an organizational mindset that no longer fit the generation of Sicilians raised in America. The structure he envisioned belonged to the old world, not the one now operating in the United States. Maranzano began preparing to rule through elimination. His plan was to remove everyone who had opposed him during the Castellammare's War, regardless of their current position or influence. A firing list was drawn up, included some of the most powerful figures in organized crime. Names like Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, Willie Moretti, and several prominent Jewish gangsters appeared on it. The message was clear: there would be no shared power. Luciano's name stood at the top of that list. To carry out the assassination, Maranzano even enlisted an Irish gangster, Vincent Call. But before the plan could be executed, Luciano learned of both the list and the contract on his life. He did not hesitate. Instead of waiting, he moved first. Luciano's initial step was calculated. He proved the existence of the firing list to those named on it, as well as 2 other influential figures who would be next if Maranzano succeeded. By doing so, he transformed Maranzano's private plan into a shared threat. Support quickly formed across criminal groups and territories. Luciano then began coordinating opposition nationwide, quietly building consensus that Maranzano had to be removed. An opportunity soon presented itself. In September of 1931, Maranzano ran into problems with the Internal Revenue Service. Luciano became aware of the situation. Because of the legal pressure, Maranzano ordered that his office guards be disarmed to avoid raising suspicion during any unexpected inspections. It was a small decision, but a critical one. Luciano acted immediately. He sent a team of assassins to Maranzano's office, instructing them to pose as Internal Revenue Service agents. The deception worked. They were allowed inside without resistance. Once inside, they murdered Maranzano and left the building before police arrived. There was no prolonged shootout, no spectacle, no warning. The killing was swift and controlled. With that act, Salvatore Maranzano became the last man to ever hold the title of boss of all bosses in the American-Italian Mafia. His death marked the final collapse of the old system. The era of centralized dictatorship ended quietly, not with chaos, but with efficiency. And in its place, a new order took shape. One built on balance, alliances, and calculation. An order that Charles Luciano had been preparing for all along. On the same day, and through the following night after Maranzano's murder, a story began circulating that would later take on a life of its own. According to this widely repeated legend, dozens of Maranzano's loyalists were hunted down and killed across the United States in a coordinated purge. The event was eventually labeled the Night of the Sicilian Supper. Yet despite how confidently it is referenced, almost no one can name even 10 specific supporters of Maranzano who were supposedly murdered during that time. This is because the event, as it is commonly described, did not happen. The myth was manufactured, then amplified over the years, until it became accepted as fact. Today it is difficult to identify who first introduced the story, but everyone who has seriously worked with archival material from that period reaches the same conclusion. There is no evidence supporting a nationwide massacre that night. Even the Last Testament of Lucky Luciano, despite all its embellishments elsewhere, rejects the story outright. Luciano himself dismissed it as pure invention. There are several reasons why the legend fails under scrutiny. First, by the time Maranzano was killed, dissatisfaction with leadership was widespread across the underworld. Many of his supposed supporters were already questioning his authority or quietly distancing themselves. Second, Luciano made no attempt to hide his motives. He openly framed Maranzano's death as a defensive action, not a declaration of continued war. Maranzano had violated the understanding that ended the Castellammare's conflict, and Luciano acted before he could be eliminated himself. Under those conditions, there was no incentive for further bloodshed. Neither Luciano nor the former Maranzano loyalists stood to gain from extending the conflict. The war was bad for business, bad for stability, and bad for survival. Once the immediate threat was removed, everyone involved had reason to step back and return to quiet operations. That transition was further reinforced by two structural changes. The title of boss of all bosses was abolished, and a commission was created to replace it. This reorganization is often credited entirely to Luciano, with claims that he had been planning it for years and personally engineered the system. That version of events is misleading. Once again, it traces back largely to the last testament of Lucky Luciano. In reality, a proto-commission had already existed during the Castellammari's War as a mechanism to manage the conflict. The idea did not originate with Luciano. It existed within the collective thinking of several senior figures who understood that centralized dictatorship had failed. Maranzano's decision to crown himself boss of all bosses interrupted that development, but it did not erase it. The concept remained alive in the memories and discussions of those who survived the war. Nick Gentile later confirmed that the commission was not Luciano's personal project. Luciano supported it, but he was only one voice among many advocating for the elimination of the old title and the creation of a shared governing body. The commission itself was designed as a ruling council, not an empire. Its purpose was to resolve disputes between families through discussion and voting rather than violence. It included the bosses of the 5 New York families, along with Al Capone representing Chicago and Frank Milano representing Cleveland. Power was deliberately distributed to prevent any single figure from dominating the system. Another persistent claim is that Luciano became the first chairman of the commission. This idea comes primarily from Joseph Bonanno's book, A Man of Honor. However, Luciano never held that position. Vincent Mangano served as the first chairman until his death. Even if Luciano had occupied the role, the position carried no special authority. A chairman's vote counted no more than any other members. The role was administrative, not dictatorial. Why? It is also important to understand that the commission was not stacked with Luciano's allies. At least 3 members were not aligned with him at all. This was not a council he could control or manipulate at will. It was a balance of competing interests, designed specifically to prevent the rise of another boss of all bosses. Luciano accepted this arrangement without complaint. In fact, it suited him perfectly. Under the new structure, he could run his family as he saw fit, pursue business quietly, and cooperate with whoever was useful at the time. Power no longer depended on titles or public dominance. It depended on flexibility, relationships, and profit. That environment favored Charles Luciano more than any throne ever could. There was no longer any distant authority above him, no single figure whose word could instantly reshape his organization or override his decisions. Luciano finally achieved what he had been working toward for years: independence. Not independence in name or status, but independence in practice. The freedom to operate, to choose partners, and most importantly, to make money without interference. The end of the Castellammari's War and the creation of the Commission restored a sense of order to the Italian Mafia. For the first time, the structure was not held together by fear of a single ruler, but by mutual interest. In that sense, it did bring a form of stability to Cosa Nostra. Conflicts and skirmishes in the New York underworld did not disappear, and Luciano was directly involved in several of them. But compared to what came before, this was a controlled environment. The years between 1931 and 1936 became the most productive and profitable period of Luciano's life. By then, he had already laid the groundwork for an international drug smuggling network, bringing narcotics into the United States. Soon after, he expanded aggressively into prostitution, establishing a wide-reaching network of brothels. These 2 enterprises would become his primary sources of income after prohibition was repealed. Together, they generated enormous revenue, allowing Luciano to build a multi-million-dollar fortune and live without restraint. Prohibition had been a foundation. These new operations became the structure that replaced it. Before examining how Luciano lived during this peak period and how his organization functioned at full capacity, it is necessary to address another enduring concept associated with his name: the so-called National Crime Syndicate. In popular accounts, the syndicate is portrayed as a vast criminal corporation spanning most of the United States. According to this view, Numerous gangs operated as regional branches with fixed territories, all governed by a central council led by Luciano himself. The reality is far less clear-cut. To begin with, historians have never reached a firm consensus on whether such a syndicate existed in the form commonly described. And even if it did exist, it was almost certainly not a centralized corporation with a single command structure. It functioned, if anything, as a loose association. A network of independent operators cooperating when it benefited them, not an organization taking orders from above. Meetings attributed to the syndicate were not sessions of command and control. They were discussions about joint investments. Gambling ventures in Las Vegas and Cuba were among the most notable examples. There are also unverified reports of money being funneled into political campaigns, including those of presidential candidates. What is telling is what these meetings did not concern themselves with. No one dictated how individual participants earned their money. Each boss retained full autonomy over his own operations. Every participant was free to conduct business as he saw fit. No council exercised authority over daily activities, not even Luciano. The idea that he, who was not the boss of all bosses of the Italian Mafia, somehow became the supreme leader of all organized crime in the United States does not withstand scrutiny, would have contradicted the very structure he had just helped create. At that stage, Luciano had no interest in ruling the entire criminal world. His focus was narrower and more practical. Prohibition was nearing its end, and he understood that the old sources of revenue were about to collapse. His attention was fixed on replacing them before that happened. Long before becoming a mafia boss, Luciano had already begun laying the foundations of a heroin smuggling operation. His attempt to establish those roots during a trip to Germany in 1930 had failed, but the failure was temporary. The connections he needed were eventually secured by a longtime associate from the Lower East Side, Del Gracci. Through him, Luciano completed the networking that would later allow his drug operation to expand on a scale few could match. What mattered was not dominance, titles, or myth. What mattered was positioning himself ahead of change. And by the early 1930s, Charles Luciano was doing exactly that. By the end of 1931, Luciano had established his own heroin route into New York. What began as a focused operation tied to familiar territory quickly expanded. Within just a few years, his market grew far beyond the Lower East Side. By 1934, his network stretched all the way to the West Coast. It was there that Luciano encountered what many drug traffickers of the era considered a perfect environment: Hollywood, a place flush with money, addiction, influence, and demand. Despite this expansion, far less is known about Luciano as a drug trafficker than about Luciano the bootlegger or Luciano the racketeer. Even less is openly discussed about Luciano the pimp. Yet this side of his empire was among the most structured and most destructive of all. Luciano built a system for the New York brothel business in which every role was clearly defined and every participant was replaceable. On the surface, it functioned efficiently. Money flowed upward without interruption. Order was maintained. Profits were steady. Beneath that surface, however, the system left lasting damage. Hundreds of young women were consumed by it. What Luciano created was not informal prostitution. It was organized sexual exploitation operating at scale. When Prohibition was repealed in 1933, many gangsters scrambled to replace the income they were about to lose. Some, like Frank Costello, turned to slot machines. Others, like Dutch Schultz, expanded into illegal lotteries, and he moved deeper into narcotics. Few paid attention to the scattered brothels operating across New York. Luciano did. He was the first to recognize how easily the entire system could be centralized through pressure, intimidation, and control. In a remarkably short time, Luciano seized control of nearly all major prostitution operations in the city. This racket became known as the Combination. At the top of the structure was Luciano himself. Beneath him sat an organized crime group, often referred to as the Mott Street Mafia, led by figures such as Abner Longy's Willman's associates Abby Heller, Dave Patillo, Jim Fredericks, and Tommy Bono. Below them were the brothel managers, commonly called madams, and the bookers who supplied women to the houses. At the bottom were the prostitutes themselves. The mechanics of the system were simple and brutally effective. Prostitutes served clients and handed over a percentage of their earnings. Madams paid a fixed rate to bookers for each woman placed in their establishment. Both madams and bookers then paid an additional percentage upward. That money ultimately flowed to Luciano. The Mott Street Group handled enforcement, collections, and discipline, taking a cut from Luciano's share in return. The flaw in this system was not operational, it was human. The women at the bottom had no meaningful agency. Most did not enter the brothels willingly. Many were brought in from other cities after being promised legitimate employment. Once in New York, they were loaned money for housing, clothing, or transportation. The debt was impossible to repay. Others were targeted by attractive and persuasive bookers who exploited trust and vulnerability. However they arrived, what followed was consistent. Once inside the system, escape became nearly impossible. Psychological and physical coercion was used to break resistance. Many women were forcibly introduced to drugs. Addiction then became a tool of control. Their earnings went directly back into Luciano's network, often through the purchase of narcotics supplied by the same organization that controlled the brothel. Leaving meant withdrawal. Staying meant survival. Under this structure, prostitutes kept none of the money they earned. Every dollar moved upward through the chain. What looked like an efficient criminal enterprise from the top functioned as a closed loop at the bottom. It was profitable, tightly managed, and deeply predatory. And it would eventually draw the attention that Luciano had spent his entire career trying to avoid. Once the women lost what the system considered their value, they were discarded without hesitation. When their appearance faded or their health declined, they were simply put out on the street and replaced by new arrivals. There was no concern for what happened to them afterward. The machine kept moving. This business alone brought Luciano roughly $2 million a year in net profit. When combined with the revenue from narcotics and the money accumulated during Prohibition, the total amounted to a fortune far beyond a single million. It was enough to ensure that Charles Luciano never had to limit himself financially for the rest of his life. Yet Luciano did not live like other crime figures of his era. He was nothing like Al Capone, who staged extravagant parties, spent vast sums publicly, and turned every appearance into a performance. Luciano preferred invisibility. He believed attention was dangerous and unnecessary. Avoided establishing a permanent residence, moving between rented rooms and hotels, often under assumed names. He had no wife and no children. He avoided long-term attachments and kept relationships light and disposable. He gave no interviews and made a deliberate effort to keep his name out of public conversation. That strategy worked, but only temporarily. Soon, a single man would emerge who would force the entire country to speak the name Charles Luciano. Until the early 1930s, New York's most powerful criminals operated with relative confidence. Arrests were rare. Convictions were rarer. Corruption and political protection allowed organized crime to function openly. That changed when Thomas Dewey entered the picture. Dewey was a prosecutor with a different approach. He was not interested in accommodation. He launched a sustained campaign against organized crime and treated it as a systemic threat rather than a collection of isolated offenses. At first, Dewey targeted smaller operators. He moved against illegal lottery operations in Harlem and brought down figures like gangster Dutch Schultz, associate Henry the Fats Miro on tax charges. Dewey understood that Miro was not a major boss. But the income figures uncovered during the investigation revealed something larger. If a mid-level criminal could generate enormous revenue, then the men above him were operating on an entirely different scale. That realization changed Dewey's focus. By early 1933, he intensified his efforts. He had gathered enough material to close in on two major figures, Waxy Gordon and Dutch Schultz. Gordon was convicted of tax evasion that same year. Schultz, however, managed to evade prosecution for the time being. Dewey did not limit his campaign to the courtroom. He understood the importance of public perception. Through radio lectures, he explained how deeply organized crime had embedded itself into American society, described it as a massive structure with reach and influence everywhere. These broadcasts shaped public understanding and created an image of a single, coordinated criminal force operating nationwide. As that image took hold, Dewey placed Luciano at its center. He began to describe him as the head of the entire operation. This framing was significant. It marked the beginning of the myth of Charles Luciano as the ultimate gangster, the unseen ruler behind everything. Whether accurate or not, the narrative was effective. After securing Gordon's conviction, Dewey turned his full attention to Dutch Schultz. Under constant surveillance and legal pressure, Schultz began to lose control of his organization. His judgments suffered. His operations became unstable. Other figures in the underworld noticed immediately. Among them was Luciano. The longer Schultz remained under scrutiny, the more vulnerable he became. And vulnerability in that world was never ignored. As the pressure mounted, Dutch Schultz's behavior grew increasingly erratic. His temper worsened, his paranoia deepened, and eventually he reached a breaking point. Unable to tolerate the constant pursuit any longer, Schultz decided to remove the problem directly. In the way he understood best, he resolved to have Thomas Dewey killed. That decision did not stay secret for long. Word of the plan spread quickly through the underworld, and instead of inspiring support, it alarmed other crime bosses. For them, Schultz's intention was not just reckless, it was dangerous. An attack on a high-profile prosecutor threatened everyone. More importantly, it gave his rivals a perfect justification to eliminate him and divide his territory. Schultz had crossed a line. On October 23, 1935, hired killers entered a cafe in New Jersey and opened fire. Schultz and several of his men were shot. He would later die from his wounds. The problem was removed. What Schultz did not realize was that by pushing events in this direction, he made things worse for Luciano. We had lost the man he had been closing in on for months. That meant he needed a new focus. This time, his attention would settle on someone far more significant. In reality, Dewey had already begun circling Luciano before Schultz's death. The difference was that Luciano had managed to stay out of sight. That protection was about to collapse. Dewey would soon drag him out of the shadows he had carefully built and place him under intense public scrutiny. From that point forward, Charles Luciano would never disappear from the public eye again. The path to him began quietly. In July of 1935, concerned citizens contacted Dewey's office about a rise in homosexual prostitution on the streets of New York. Dewey took the complaint seriously and ordered an investigation. As his office dug deeper, it quickly became clear that this was only a small fragment of something much larger. What appeared at first to be a limited issue turned out to be a gateway into the city's entire prostitution economy. The more investigators uncovered, the clearer the pattern became. This was not random activity. It was organized, centralized, structured. By early 1936, Dewey understood that a single system controlled prostitution in New York. To expose it fully, he authorized a large-scale operation. In February 1936, coordinated raids were carried out across the city's brothels. 125 people were arrested. Prostitutes, madams, and bookers were taken into custody and interrogated. One by one, under pressure, they described the same hierarchy, the same payment routes, the same names. Piece by piece, investigators reconstructed the entire structure of Luciano's combination. At that point, Dewey had what he needed. The only obstacle left was Luciano himself. Anticipating trouble, Charles had already left New York and traveled to Hot Springs, Arkansas, a place known for sheltering criminals under the protection of local authorities. Dewey responded immediately. He ordered Luciano's arrest and requested bail be set at $200,000. What followed surprised him. The local judge ignored the request and set bail at just $5,000. Luciano paid it instantly and walked free. In April of 1936, he prepared to flee again, this time to Mexico. But Dewey moved faster. Assistant arrived in Hot Springs, persuaded a judge to issue a new warrant, and ordered Luciano held without bail. The escape collapsed before it began. Luciano was placed back in local custody, where conditions were unusually comfortable. Dewey then demanded his extradition to New York. Local authorities refused, citing a supposed Arkansas conviction that prevented Luciano from leaving the state. Through the governor of Arkansas, state rangers effectively seized control of the jail holding Luciano. He was transferred to a prison in the state capital, where conditions were far harsher. From there, Luciano was finally moved to New York before his lawyers could mount a successful appeal. The trial that followed was swift and decisive. Luciano was convicted and sentenced to 35 years in prison. The man who had built his power by avoiding attention now stood fully exposed, brought down not by violence, but by structure, testimony, and persistence. It was the longest sentence handed down to anyone involved in that case. More importantly, It marked the first time a gangster of Luciano's stature had been successfully imprisoned for something other than tax violations. With that verdict, Thomas Dewey achieved something unprecedented. He turned Luciano into the public symbol of organized crime itself. The trial became the cover image through which the entire phenomenon was judged. In the years that followed, many would focus only on that cover and never look deeper. Luciano's name became shorthand for everything wrong with organized crime, creating the false impression that the image came first and the structure followed. In reality, the structure existed long before the image, but once the public narrative was set, few bothered to question it. When Luciano entered prison, control of his family initially passed to Vito Genovese. That transition immediately raised questions about how much influence Charles truly retained. Genovese wanted full power for himself, something he would later confirm openly. His ambitions, however, quickly drew attention. Almost immediately after Luciano's conviction, Genovese found himself in Dewey's sights as well. By 1937, the pressure became too great, and Genovese fled to Italy to avoid prosecution. With Genovese gone, Frank Costello stepped in. Costello visited Luciano frequently in prison and gradually assumed operational control of the family. In practice, this meant that even behind bars, Luciano remained connected to decision-making. Through Costello, his influence continued, though indirectly. At the same time, Luciano entrusted the management of his personal finances and remaining assets to his longtime partner, Meyer Lansky. Despite the sentence, Luciano never abandoned hope of overturning his conviction. His lawyers worked continuously for years, filing appeals and seeking reviews. None of it produced results. The legal system held firm. What finally changed his circumstances had nothing to do with the courts. It had everything to do with global events. As the 1930s progressed, the American underworld had already begun positioning itself against fascist movements. This cooperation was not formal and not public, but it was real. Italian criminal groups opposed Mussolini's regime, which had persecuted them back home. Jewish gangsters actively resisted American fascist organizations sympathetic to Hitler, driven by what was happening to Jewish communities in Europe. These alignments existed long before the government acknowledged them. When the United States formally entered World War II at the end of 1941, the situation became urgent. German submarines inflicted heavy losses on shipping along the East Coast. Ships leaving the port of New York were attacked regularly. At the same time, fears grew about sabotage operations carried out by agents of the Third Reich operating directly on American docks. The moment that forced the issue came on February 9, 1942. A massive fire disabled the luxury liner Normandy, a vessel worth $56 million and capable of transporting up to 10,000 troops. The damage was catastrophic. From that point on, Navy officials realized they were vulnerable on their own territory. Two versions of the incident circulated almost immediately. One claimed German saboteurs were responsible. The other suggested that the Italian Mafia, acting on Luciano's orders, caused the fire to pressure the government into seeking their help. Which version is accurate remains unresolved. In practical terms, it does not matter. Both explanations lead to the same outcome. After the disaster, the Navy turned to the people who truly controlled the docks. They approached Joe Lanza, a powerful figure who dominated the port workers' unions and controlled much of the fish trade. Lanza himself was under investigation at the time. Even so, he agreed to cooperate with naval intelligence, and he did so without receiving any formal guarantees that charges against him would be dropped. That decision opened a door. And behind that door stood Charles Luciano. Joe Lanza's cooperation with the authorities did not remain secret for long. Meyer Lansky learned about it quickly. Lansky had known Lanza for years and had helped him on more than one occasion. When he connected that fact with Luciano's imprisonment, he recognized an opportunity that might never come again. For the first time since Luciano had gone to prison, there was a realistic path to securing his release. At Lansky's request, Lanza told representatives of the Navy that he had already done everything within his reach. If they needed deeper access and greater influence over the docks, they would have to speak to someone far more powerful than himself. With that statement, Lanza pointed them directly toward Lucky Luciano. The Navy officials were satisfied with the results of their cooperation with Lanza, so they followed his advice. They contacted Luciano's attorney, Moses Polikoff, who in turn directed them to Meyer Lansky. Lansky had already laid the groundwork. Through him, naval intelligence was put into direct contact with the leadership of the Luciano family. Luciano's terms were simple and unchanged from Lansky's position. He demanded no guarantees, no written promises, no formal concessions. Officially, he was offered nothing in return, except the chance to assist his country during wartime. Luciano accepted, but with one strict condition: cooperation would remain secret. Public knowledge of it could have been disastrous, especially considering that at the end of his sentence, he was expected to be deported to Italy. The arrangement benefited both sides. The Navy gained control and intelligence over the docks, limiting sabotage and protecting vital supply routes. Luciano, meanwhile, regained indirect access to the outside world through Lansky and Costello, who served as intermediaries. His influence expanded again. Prison restrictions loosened. Visits became easier. Information flowed both ways. There was another consequence as well. The cooperation reinforced the growing myth of Luciano as the undisputed ruler of the underworld. That image had first been shaped by Dewey during the trial. It was strengthened when Lanza, at Lansky's urging, presented Luciano to the government as the only man capable of solving their problem. Government officials accepted the narrative. What began as a strategic exaggeration slowly hardened into perceived truth. As the war progressed, Luciano's value increased further. When German sabotage along the docks was brought under control, and American forces began preparing for operations in Italy, his knowledge became useful again. Luciano provided intelligence about his homeland. He identified regions, contacts, and local power structures. He explained who could be trusted, who could be persuaded, and how alliances could be formed on the ground. This information helped shape American planning during the Italian campaign. The landings were successful. The advance continued. The contribution was indirect, but real. And although Luciano had been promised nothing, the outcome was clear. In February 1946, shortly after the war ended, Charles Luciano was released from custody. The freedom came with a condition. He was immediately deported to Italy. From that moment forward, he would never again set foot in the country that had defined his life and career. At 48 years old, Luciano regained his freedom, but it was the freedom of exile. After his release, he was taken to Ellis Island, where he remained for a short time awaiting departure. On the eve of his return to Italy, several longtime associates came to see him. Among them were Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello. It was a quiet farewell, no speeches, no ceremony, just the closing of a chapter that would never be reopened. After saying goodbye to his associates and longtime allies, Luciano left the United States aboard a cargo ship. 17 days after departing on February 28, 1946, he arrived in Naples. From the moment he stepped off the gangway, Italian authorities took him into custody. He was brought directly to a police station and questioned about his reasons for being in the country. The interview was brief. Afterward, Luciano was released and allowed to travel on to Sicily, to his parents' hometown of Leccara Fritti. He stayed there for several months, surrounded by relatives and familiar ground. But this was not a retirement. It was a pause. Almost immediately, Luciano began thinking about how to return to the United States. The risk did not deter him. Re-entering America would have meant immediate rearrest and the possibility of serving the remaining 25 years of his sentence. Even that did not outweigh the reason driving him forward. That reason was money. From Italy, Luciano was cut off from the empire he had spent decades building. He had created systems, routes, and structures that continued to generate wealth. Yet he had never fully enjoyed the results. Prison had taken that from him. Exile threatened to make it permanent. At the same time, another concern weighed heavily. Vito Genovese, who had already attempted to seize control of the family once, had returned to the United States. It would have been naive to believe he would not try again. Luciano's first plan involved Mexico. Between July and September of 1946, the FBI received intelligence reports indicating that Luciano intended to cross into the United States through Tijuana. American authorities coordinated with local officials and conducted extensive checks throughout the city and surrounding areas. Luciano was never found. Whether he successfully slipped through or intentionally spread the information to test law enforcement remains unclear. The second route was more concrete. Cuba. At the time, the island functioned almost like an unofficial extension of the United States. From Havana to Miami was barely an hour by plane. Luciano could remain close to American operations without technically violating the terms of his deportation. It was an ideal position. There was another reason Cuba made sense. Meyer Lansky had long been laying the groundwork for a massive gambling operation there. He had been cultivating relationships with Cuban officials since the early 1930s. Luciano planned to invest heavily. Cuba offered proximity, influence, and opportunity without immediate legal risk. Luciano arrived in Cuba in late 1946. Some accounts claim he traveled there by way of Mexico. Others say he came directly from Italy. By that time, thanks to Lansky's connections, Luciano already possessed an official visa. His presence was known but tolerated. Shortly after his arrival, Havana became the site of one of the most important underworld meetings in history. The Havana Conference brought together nearly every major crime boss of the era. The primary focus was gambling, specifically whether the American underworld should commit fully to transforming Cuba into a gambling hub. After extended discussion, the decision was made to proceed. The plan was largely driven by Lansky, with Luciano's support. Another subject quickly took center stage: Benjamin Siegel.
Dogsy?
Siegel had been overseeing construction of the Flamingo Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas. Many powerful figures had invested heavily in the project. Costs continued to spiral. More troubling, reports surfaced that Siegel's girlfriend, Virginia Hill, had been transferring portions of the construction funds into her Swiss bank accounts. Confidence in Siegel collapsed. Lansky attempted to defend him, arguing for patience. The arguments failed. By a vote of the assembled bosses, Siegel was sentenced to death. The decision was final. The conference ended with clear outcomes. Cuba would become the next frontier, and loose ends would be dealt with accordingly. The Havana Conference predictably drew the attention of American authorities. At the time, they firmly believed that Luciano was the central figure of the criminal underworld in the United States. From their perspective, his presence in Cuba was unacceptable. The decision was made that he had to be removed, regardless of diplomatic cost. Two agencies were brought into the effort. The FBI and the Bureau of Narcotics coordinated pressure on the Cuban government, making it clear that Luciano's continued stay would not be tolerated. By the end of February 1947, that pressure produced results. Cuban authorities agreed to expel Luciano from the country. On March 20, 1947, Charles Luciano was forced to leave Cuba and was extradited once again to Italy. The objective was simple: keep him as far from the United States as possible. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover personally reinforced this strategy by sending letters to governments across Latin America, urging them not to accept Luciano under any circumstances. Upon his arrival in Italy, Luciano was immediately detained, spent 9 days in prison in Genoa before being transferred to Palermo, where he remained under arrest for another 9 days. After a total of 18 days in custody, he was released. He was then allowed to travel to Rome, where he rented an apartment, and for the first time since his deportation, had the space to think clearly about his future. By then, the position of the United States government was unmistakable. Luciano would not be allowed anywhere near American soil. That reality fundamentally changed his situation. Managing affairs in New York from across the Atlantic was increasingly unrealistic. He could still receive income from investments tied to Meyer Lansky's operations. He could receive occasional payments from the New York Mafia for past services. Frank Costello, while still in control of the family, could send him money discreetly. But all of it combined amounted to a fraction of what Luciano had once earned. For a man who had built his power through direct involvement, this was not sustainable. If he was going to remain in Italy permanently, he needed something of his own. A source of income that could replace what he had lost. Drug trafficking seemed like the obvious answer, and this is where another myth begins. It is commonly claimed that Luciano became a key architect of post-war heroin smuggling from Italy to the United States. The reality is far less convincing. What do the facts actually show? Shortly after his expulsion from Cuba, Luciano did travel through countries known for heroin production. Those movements were closely monitored. The U.S. Bureau of Narcotics took notice immediately and intensified its surveillance. At the same time, American authorities pressured Italian law enforcement to keep Luciano under constant watch. Throughout the 1950s, Luciano lived under near-continuous observation. Any hint of involvement in drug trafficking led to immediate action. He was arrested repeatedly on suspicion alone. His passport was confiscated to prevent him from leaving Italy. His movements within the country were restricted. At times, he was even placed under a curfew. This level of scrutiny made one thing clear: he was not operating freely. Pressure had consequences beyond law enforcement. Local mafia figures in Italy became reluctant to work with him. No one wanted the attention that followed Luciano. Rumors that he had cooperated with authorities during the war only deepened that hesitation. His reputation, once an asset, became a liability. Overall, Luciano retained a measure of respect in Italy, largely because of his friendship with a powerful local boss, Calogero Vizzini. That relationship offered protection, but it did not restore influence. If Luciano had truly been a central figure in international drug trafficking during those years, the situation would have looked very different. Given the level of corruption within Italian institutions at the time and the enormous profits generated by narcotics, he would not have been subjected to relentless surveillance and repeated arrests. The reality is simpler and less dramatic. Luciano was watched too closely, restricted too tightly, and isolated too thoroughly to rebuild the kind of empire he once controlled. The myths persisted. The power did not. Likewise, if Luciano had truly been running a large-scale international drug smuggling network, it would have granted him far more authority in the Italian underworld than he actually possessed. His real standing at the time is best illustrated by a telling incident involving a local mafioso named Antonio Calderone. In front of witnesses, Calderone, a relatively minor Neapolitan street figure, openly slapped Luciano across the face. Although Calderone was later killed, the episode itself speaks volumes. It showed how far Luciano's influence had declined, and how differently he was perceived, compared to the myths surrounding his name. Further confirmation of Luciano's marginal role comes from events in 1957. That year, Joe Bonanno negotiated a major agreement to organize heroin deliveries to the United States. Crucially, he did not negotiate with Luciano. Instead, he dealt directly with the Sicilian boss Giuseppe Genco Russo. Luciano was not even invited to the meeting. For a man supposedly at the center of global drug trafficking, his absence from such negotiations is difficult to ignore. There is another point that cannot be overlooked. Despite constant surveillance by the U.S. Bureau of Narcotics and Italian police, despite repeated arrests, interrogations, and years of pressure on anyone suspected of involvement in drug trafficking, no solid case against Luciano ever emerged. Over more than a decade, allegations of his central role in smuggling never progressed beyond theory and speculation. After his expulsion from Cuba, Luciano clearly wanted to establish a source of income in Italy that could match what he had lost. That never happened. Instead, he survived largely on money sent by friends in the United States. Even that support gradually faded. Frank Costello, under pressure from Vito Genovese, stepped down as boss of the family, and the payments stopped. Then came the Cuban Revolution, which wiped out most of Luciano's remaining investments in gambling operations on the island. As his financial situation worsened, Luciano looked for another solution. He turned to his own story, began exploring the idea of selling the rights to a film about his life. He even started working on a screenplay and became acquainted with film producer Barnett Glassman. Glassman himself showed little enthusiasm, but his assistant, Martin Gosch, was deeply interested. And in February 1961, Gosch spent long hours with Luciano, shaping the narrative of the film. The script was eventually completed and approved. A contract was signed that promised Luciano $100,000, along with a percentage of future profits. It appeared, briefly, that he had found a way to secure his final years. Then reality intervened. Old contacts from New York made it clear that such a film was not welcome. The message was delivered without threats, but it was unmistakable. The project had to end. In January 1962, Luciano arranged a meeting with Gosch to explain that there would be no film. Gosch flew to Naples to see him. Luciano personally went to the airport to meet him. After greeting Gosch and leaving the terminal together, Luciano suddenly collapsed. He had been suffering from heart problems for some time. On January 26, 1962, Charles Luciano suffered a fatal heart attack. The man known to the world as Lucky Luciano was dead. 3 days later, on January 29th, a memorial service was held in Naples. Those in attendance were mostly family members, a few minor gangsters, and a noticeable presence of police. Among prominent figures from the underworld, only Joe Adonis appeared in person. Meyer Lansky, Luciano's closest lifelong friend, sent flowers instead. 2 weeks later, Luciano's body was transported to the United States. He was buried in the family crypt in Queens, New York, where he remains to this day. This was the life of Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the most mythologized gangster in American history.
Oh.
A man whose reputation on paper grew far larger than the reality of his power. He was neither the omnipotent mastermind of legend, nor a minor figure dismissed by history. His true place lies between those extremes, shaped as much by myth, fear, and storytelling, as by the choices he actually made.